Hello, Internet. My name is Bret, and this is my show. Welcome to my live stream, assuming you're here live. If you're not, this is something we do every Thursday for 3 years now. Quite a lot. We're about to hit episode 200. We're coming up on week 200. So thanks for being here live. I usually have guests like we have today, and if not, it's usually like a Q&A or something. So come back if this is your first time for the Q&A sessions where we can talk all things Kubernetes, Docker, DevOps. Today we're going to be talking about development environments, specifically remote environments for development with Octeto. But first, let me just tell you, this show is sponsored by you, the patrons of this channel. Thank you so much to those of you that are supporting this. If you want to get updates weekly on my open source, who's going to be on the live show, who's going to be on the podcast, all the things I'm creating, you can just scroll down and click the follow button. That is right here, the one that's spinning. I don't know why that's spinning. But if you can just get emails that way, right? So it's like 1 or 2 a week. And then if you would like some extra benefits or the High Fivers program where we meet monthly and we actually do a hangout in Discord, you can get that for a coffee a month. If you didn't hear last week, by the way, the Loot Shop has launched. Our merch store is finally live. I'm so excited about this, and we're just getting started. So you can get little DevOps love mugs like that, and excuse me, and you can get T-shirts and all sorts of other stuff. We started with some basic designs that we've had. This is actually in partnership with a couple of designer friends of mine, and we've already got more planning that we have the team working on now. So please go check it out. You can get that at that is store.bretfisher.com. The link is below if you want to check out some of that merch. You can also sometimes see the merch in YouTube, which is pretty cool. But yeah, let me know if you have ideas for anything DevOps that you want on a shirt. Let me know on Twitter or here or somewhere else. Yeah, and that's exciting. We've been working hard on that for a couple of months. So I now have all the shirts on, the SneakerNet shirt, and we bought a big order of everything. So I'm just now I got to wait for fall for wearing my sweatshirt that I bought. So, all right, let's get to it. Thanks so much for being on the show. So we're going to be talking about Octeto today with the founder. We got Ramiro Berrelleza. Let me see if I get my R in there. Berrelleza, something like that. Thanks for being on the show, Ramiro.
Hey, Brett. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. It's so cool after watching your show for so long to get a chance to chat with you here. Super exciting for me too.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on the show. We actually met years ago. We were actually trying to figure out when we met. Back when you were a young startup.
Yeah, that must have been, 3 years ago. I think it was right when maybe we're not even a startup because Octeto started as an open source project. Still going strong. I think we met even before we thought this might be a company. A lot of things have happened since then.
Yeah, and that's super cool. And I think that's kind of, it just reminds me of all this stuff, that the ecosystem that Docker containers actually started, right? Like that it spin us down this crazy road of, if we look back, it seems obvious now that we all have it. But when I look back 9 years ago, it's like a lot of these companies that exist, a lot of the ways we do these things now, those ideas hadn't been made yet. And it's pretty cool to see some of this stuff come to fruition. And yeah, I'm glad you're still here.
You're right. It's like I never thought about it that way, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It's really cool. So many companies and so many tools and new ways of doing things, like remote dev environments. We do a lot to that team at Docker.
Yeah, and in fact, I think that's actually how we got connected, was through the Docker team. And excuse me, sorry. So remote and development environments are. Obviously, you had this idea of there's an easier way to do this at the time. Take us back to what was the inspiration for Octeto?
Yeah, so the inspiration for Octeto was that, as you mentioned, I've been involved in the Docker ecosystem from a very early days. Mm-hmm. My co-founders at Octeto, that's how we met. We were all working at this startup. We're building DevOps tools, and we're trying to figure out application deployment, production rollouts, your typical thing. And that's where we kind of got introduced to Docker. And it was really cool. We loved the easy to use, one command, up and running experience. Fast forward a few years, and I was working for this other company, and we're building this massive, global microservice-based application. It was not yet on Kubernetes. It was running on VMs, on containers. We were trying to get it to Kubernetes. And one of the things we realized is that it was really hard for developers to actually develop and build this these big applications. Once you have a bunch of microservices, different databases, once you kind of hit that point where it was really hard to run everything on my laptop. And I was like, hey, there has to be a better way for this. This cannot be the status quo. We're trying to do things with Vagrant. It kind of worked, but it was still not ideal. And that's when I kind of hit me that, hey, if we're building all these applications to run on the cloud with orchestration and multiple microservices and all these really good things, we were like, hey, why don't we try to do the same thing for developers? And this is kind of cliche, but it was true for us. And like we started the open source project because we were trying to fix some problem that we ourselves, we're trying to scratch our own back. It's like, I hate having to wait for containers to build for me to be able to see my code changes on Kubernetes. I want something faster. And that's how the initial idea of why don't we just develop directly on the container started to kind of like gestate. It was first containers. Then we were like, well, if you already have a container, and this was way before VS Code got with like dev containers and made it super simple. It was like with scripts and things.
Yeah.
But it was like, hey, why don't we just move this container and then put it on a Kube cluster on the cloud, which also came from a problem I was having, which I had a laptop that I could just not get Minikube to run locally for whatever reason. And we kind of started building this idea. Eventually, we did like a very quick prototype, show it to some of our friends. And at the beginning, most people didn't get it. They were like, why do I need this remote dev environment? I should just run things locally. But for us, was this very obvious, like, well, because, if your application doesn't fit, if it's too big, it's going to be super slow. And then, as we got deeper and deeper into this world, we started to discover other great benefits like realistic dev environments, preview. But it was all started as this pain point that I had as a developer. And then it was really fun to work on. It's really fun to be able to work on a tool that you are the first user, because it's very obvious when you're building something. Oh yeah, this works. I like it. It's fun. You talk to your friends. You start to build a community of like people who kind of share these ideas. And that was 3 years ago. And since then, slowly we kept developing the open source project. Then we started to build a commercial product, and that's where we are today with this idea of remote dev environments for any team that's building container-based applications. I do believe that they need something like this.
Yeah.
Just because there's so many resources you can access once you're in the cloud, once you're not limited to whatever you can run on your local machine, that it does for a much nicer, easier to use, and faster experience. Or at least that's what we hope.
Right.
We can help people get to with Octeto and all the other tools that are out there.
Yeah. It's funny that I almost feel like we got decent as an industry. We got better at web-based IDEs before we understood the development infrastructure we needed to run those apps, right? Because we like Cloud9 was out a long time ago. Obviously before VS Code and all the stuff we have now. But I remember these web IDs were coming out, and you could run the app, like you could run that one app, but getting everything else running wasn't really a part of their problem set. And if you had a significantly complex app, that especially if you're dealing, I feel like sometimes it's even harder with monoliths, because what is it? I think it's Kelsey Hightower. I think that was the quote. I heard this quote from a couple years ago where he said, if you have to start everything locally in order to work on one microservice, then all you did was build a distributed monolith. And I loved that. And of course that you can't take that one quote and put everyone in it, because there's always exceptions. But I feel like that when I work with teams that are struggling with this problem, that's kind of what they've done, is they've built a distributed monolith. So they do need a lot of infrastructure, and it's usually pretty. I mean, there's a team I worked with last year, and they had basically one engineer's half-time job was simply maintaining the repo that built and designed their local setup. And like his job was to just run the local development experience for the devs, because it was, even with containers, they had this really complex problem of just keeping everything working and ready, and it like you said, doesn't always work on Minikube or whatever else. Like some people on Windows, some people on Mac, the same tool doesn't work the same way on either OS. And it was just every week it was another problem that they were fighting, and another update to all of our dev environments. And
that update, that problem is one that I used to work for this team. It was a problem because one of the things we've been talking a lot. I mean, you know this metaphor of like the pets versus cattle when it comes to like services and deployments, right? The same thing happens with dev environments, because if you don't have something to automate your dev environment, your machine is like this pet that you have to be very careful, because every time you install something, you run the risk of just breaking the whole thing. And it happens, right? Like, oh, you bring like the latest Python update, and then suddenly some of your dependencies stop running because they can only run on Python, I don't know, 3.6 instead of 3.7. And I'm not
right. Yeah.
As an example, I don't want to like talk ill of Python. Actually, I love Python. I'm a Python developer, but as an example, right? And that's part of the problem. Is it's not just the monolith. It's not just microservices. It's the whole thing. And I think, as you said, the Cloud IDE ecosystem understood this part very well, very early. Of like, hey, we need something ephemeral. But the problem they run is exactly what you said. That works great if you have a single service. But the reality is that most modern applications, they just grow because it's so easy, right? Like any non-trivial application is going to have 2-3 microservices, a couple of different stores. You have your cache, a database, maybe some blob storage. You might be using something like local stack. So slowly, it's adding up to it. So our idea with remote dev environments is you don't need all of that running locally. And the other thing that was very important for us is you don't need to know that thing, how to run it, what is running it, because that's the other problem with this modern dev environments. You either go the route of abstraction, where you're just one command and the environment is running, which I think is the ideal world, or you go the path of you have to understand every piece of architecture, every piece of the stack. And that's where you get into like, you have to know how to run Minikube, and you need to know how to run kubectl apply and Helm upgrade and how to build images. And it starts to become this gigantic cognitive load that for me is one of the things that makes teams lose a lot of productivity, because you get blocked by so many pieces. What do I do? Where do I start? If I want to upgrade something. That's where, like, like a few years ago, like what Vagrant was doing with like, hey, Vagrant up, 1 VM, everything is there. Or Docker Compose up, which to me is like still the gold standard. Your entire stack in one command, completely independent of whatever is running internally. That's what I think, that's where we need to be with cloud native applications, with this remote dev environment idea of one command, spin up everything, wherever. And by remote, we mean not your laptop. It could be a on-prem, cloud services, somewhere else. And then just develop. And just, part of what we do is try to make it as transparent as possible. So developers, they just need to focus on their code. And they let the environment take care of all these other things, like building artifacts and deploying things.
Right. So you mentioned, let's get into the product a little bit. You mentioned cloud-based. And it sounds like, is there a self-hosted option?
So in the case of Octeto, yes, we have 3 different options. There's an open source CLI that if you have your own Kubernetes cluster, you need more. Just run Octeto up, and it will create your dev environment on Octeto. That's great if it's just you, like you're developing on your own, single person. We have a self-hosted option that is free for teams of up to 10 people. It's a Helm chart you install on your Kubernetes cluster. And then that gives you a lot more. It gives you a very nice dashboard, automation with GitHub and GitLab. It even includes like its own container registry and build service. So you can just run everything, including your builds, on the cluster. And then we also have a hosted service if you don't want to run this yourself, or, for like large organizations, enterprises. It's really fun how this concept of remote dev environments and dev experience is something that the entire industry is now aware of. It's not just something that one developer cares about or just
Right.
startups. It's something we're now seeing startups, public companies, very traditional enterprises. So it's really cool that everybody's looking for like, how do I make my life easier when I'm
Right.
building? Because as you know, Kubernetes is now everywhere. Like if you go to KubeCon, every company is there.
Yeah.
Everything from like pharmaceuticals to banks to like bleeding edge startups. So they all have these problems, and that's what we're trying to give them. Is a tool, super easy to use, to build your experience on top of it, and to be able to use whatever you feel like. If you want to use a cloud IDE, that works with Octeto. If you want to bring your own debugger, your own test tooling. The idea with our remote dev environments is that we're just kind of like we just take whatever you want and we'll put it on the cloud and give you access to it in a very easy to use way. How that looks like, that's up to you. If it's one service, if it's 10 services, if it's Java or PHP or Go, that is entirely up to the developer.
Hmm. So yeah, and is that one of the things that's unique is this tool doesn't run like I don't have a specific IDE I have to use, right? Like this isn't something that's sort of dictating the tooling that I have to use.
Yeah, that was for me, one of the benefits of building developer tools, or one of the things I really like about building developer tools, is that you can push your ideas and you can be very, like dogmatic, like how I want this to work. And for us, because we've been burned by these kind of tools before as developers, it was very important to make it, that Docker phrase of like batteries included but replaceable. I love
Yeah.
that, and I love that
Yeah.
approach. And every tool I've built since then, I tried to follow that guidance. And for us, that meant, hey, what is the most personal thing for the developer? And it's the IDE, because
Mm.
you have, and you've done shows on this, your own shell, your own fonts, the size of your font that we were talking about in the
Right.
pre-show. So for us, it's like, hey, bring your own IDE, bring your own stack, and that's something that sets us apart. Is we kind of build this tool so that you have your IDE, you bring your source code, whichever way you're doing it, and then you can just through our tooling connect that with your remote dev environment that's running on Octeto. And we have users that like to use VS Code, as you can imagine, but also Vim, Gitpod. We actually wrote a blog post last week on how to connect Gitpod and Octeto to give you this really cool everything is remote experience.
Right.
You have your IDE with all your extensions in one side, and you have your entire Cube infrastructure on the other side in one click. So it's like that. You bring it your own, and we're trying to build it in a way that is completely adaptable, to the point that actually one of our community members sent a PR a couple of weeks ago for Octeto to work on ARM clusters.
Mm-hmm.
So you can now even have like an ARM cluster running on like a Graviton instance whenever, deploy your environment there, and you don't care, because for you it's just your app's running there, your code's going to get pushed there, and you just write code and see the results, which is the end goal, to make all these other things transparent and make sure only the people who really care about those things, they
Right.
need to get at that level of kind of like tinkering with.
Very cool. I think that for me specifically, iPad development is something I think I want. Every time, until very recently, it's been, the IDEs for coding have been not so great, and they've been very limited, and like they're very traditional in their mindset. But I'm not actually convinced I need iPad development, but I like the idea of being able to take a very small device with an all-day battery and being able to just develop in a browser that doesn't cause major limitations. And I feel like we're on the cusp of that. I'm curious because I think I saw an early demo of this years and years ago, but I haven't used it since. So can we get into a demo?
Yeah, of course. I love that. Let me share my screen. There we go. And I'm going to use VS Code, but this kind of what I wanted to show is it works with anything. And the idea with this is we're going to have this application, and this demo is open source. If you go to github.com/Octeto/movies. You can get the exact same thing I'm doing. You can run this on any kube cluster, or our cloud service is also free. You can try it there, whenever. But this is, your standard cloud native container based application. It's a small app that we built that allows you to rent movies. It has a catalog, it has an API, and kind of a workflow to process the rentals of your movies. It's kind of over-architected on purpose to show what a real big cloud-native application looks like. So it has a bit of everything. It has the streaming, it has a Kafka instance, it has Postgres, it has a MongoDB instance, and then every microservice is a different programming language. We have a React front end, and the catalog is in Go, the API is in Java, I believe, and then the renting service is in Node.js and Express. Just to show, as I was saying earlier, how our goal is, your application is anything you need it to be. It can be polyglot, it can be all in the same stack. It's completely, we don't really care. And everything, because this is a Kube native application, is defined as Helm charts and container images. And everything is there. I'm not going to go through the entire repo. It's a mono repo, but everything is there. The way Octeto works, kind of what drives Octeto, is this file called octeto.yaml. You put it on the root of your repo if you need to. By the way, if you have a Docker Compose application, you don't need anything. It just works. Octeto up, and Octeto will translate your Docker Compose app to Kubernetes and deploy everything and build everything for you. But for this app, we do have this file defined. And what this file defines is the 3 stages of your application, which are built. How do you want to build your application, your dev environment? In this case, we're just simply building every image, the front-end image. We're building a development image for the front end, for the catalog, for everything. Then you have
it looks like you're targeting stages there, like you have dev stages in your Docker files, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So and this is kind of where it gets really interesting, that we're reusing all the other things you have, because if you follow the standard Docker practices, this is how we define the image for the front end. And your standard one stage for your dependencies, your package.json, yarn install, yarn build. And then you have the second phase, which is for just, in this case, Nginx, with your static assets, which for production is great because you get a very small image, very easy to push, low chance of vulnerabilities, and all those fantastic things. But when you're developing, you do need more things. You need if you're developing a React app, you need the React runtime, Node, all these dependencies. So what Octeto allows you to do is, when you build your dev environment, you can tell Octeto, hey, I need the final image, but I also need you to build a dev image. And we're just using the same notation that Docker does of, the context, the target, to build images. Not every image is needed to build this way. Like the Express one is the same. The one from Maven is the same. It's very flexible in that sense. It's really up to you. And what we try to do with this demo is kind of show you all the possibilities. So you can take this and then build your own dev environment, whichever way it fits best for you. The second phase is deploy. So now that we have all the images built, we're going to deploy the dev environment. In this case, it's all using Helm charts. Postgres, Kafka, and Mongo are using just the public Bitnami authored charts. And then front-end, catalog, rent service, worker, and API are the charts that we created. And Octeto has this syntax, and it's everything on the docs that will allow you to do things like inject the image you just built. And instead of having to hard code the name of the image, you just put an environment variable, and Octeto will automatically fill it in with the right tag, the right name, the right registry, all those things. Part of our goal here, and you'll see this across all of our tooling, is we want to make everything that is non-essential for development just happen automatically. And for instance, the tag of your container image is something that when you're developing, it doesn't matter. You want to write code, push it, and see the results. So Octeto just creates an image for you, puts them on this registry that ships with Octeto, and when you're done, it gets thrown away. Like, these are ephemeral images, so you don't have to worry about it. And we did this because when I'm developing, you always have to do Docker build and then Docker tag, and you have to think of a tag, and you have to rewrite the tag that was there before. So our goal here is like all that just goes away. Don't think about it. Just point us to where your chart is, and we'll take care of all those things.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
cool.
finally,
Sorry, I was going to say that's cool because there's typically friction that I have with when I'm working on projects where we're implementing containers and we're trying to figure out that dev environment and all those different things. One of the challenges is like usually we'll end up in a significant size team. You'll end up with two image registries where like there's the one for production that's sort of blessed to be in the server, and then the devs just need something they can just work with, right? Like it might be Docker Hub, it might be GitHub, but then you end up having to manage that and deleting old images and like how do you do cleanup, and there is that usually teams get to the point where they're like, we just want this other registry that's just sort of throwaway. Like we want everything ephemeral. We want, and you have to end up implementing that all yourself and writing scripts or finding GitHub actions or it's a lot of. Every time we do it, it's a lot of work. So I should have done.
yeah, that was something that. No, I liked it a lot, and this is a context that Paulo, our CTO, kind of as he was talking to people, just kind of came up with it, and it's this. I like it because it's very simple, but all these small things of like not having to think of the tag, not having to manually change, and you put Ramiro / image. Like if you check my Docker Hub account before Octeto, I have a million images there with like test tag, test one, the date, and every time you have to think of these things, it's more friction, and it's really not what matters. So this idea of making all of these artifacts for development ephemeral, but using the same technology that you're going to be using on CI/CD and in production, I like it a lot, and I think it makes for a much faster experience. Because one of our goals with these remote dev environments is because they look like production. You're using Helm, you're building images, you're using Kubernetes. The likelihood of catching up issues only until production is going to go down. Mm-hmm. And if you can accomplish that, plus give you this fast experience with no friction, I think we're all going to be in a much happier dev world.
Right. Yeah, because like we talk about a lot, like Kubernetes was not made for developers, right? It was designed by operators that happen to be developers, but it's always felt to me like a round peg or a square peg trying to go in a round hole kind of thing, where I kind of downplay it. So part of the thing for this show was, bring me up to date on Octeto so that I can get out of my old mindset of, I don't want Kubernetes in my dev workflow because it can be problematic. It is a lot of effort. It feels like, especially when you're handwriting manifests, right? Or if you're handwriting customized templates just to do local development stuff. And I'm the sysadmin that's normally doing the ops stuff, so I'm okay with that. But every team I work with, they just look at this as a burden that they don't want. They just are so tired of broken. They don't understand everything anymore because the app is too complex. So they don't know it all. They can't build their own dev environments from scratch because we've made it so complex they can't figure it out. And it ends up in a very, in any team that's more than a few years old, you end up with this fragile developer experience where everyone doesn't understand their stack because it's too many tools. They cobble them all together. So I totally interrupted your demo.
No, this is fantastic. Everything you mentioned is making me think of so many different things, and that is the core of why we felt like something like Octeto was needed, because Kubernetes is really good at giving you infrastructure on demand. Like I've tried to build similar tools like Octeto before, but it was VMs and processes were clunky, and the fact that you can spin up a container in a second, like it's crazy. We have users of Octeto that are spinning dev environments that have, and I'm not kidding, 80 containers per developer, and you have 300 developers on a single cluster, each of them launching these dev environments with one click. And it's really cool because Kubernetes scales really well. What's missing is giving you the abstraction and the tooling so that you as a developer don't have to interact with Kubernetes. Because I agree with you. You don't want Kubernetes on your dev flow. You don't want the stock Kubernetes. What a Kubernetes, where you're installing something like Octeto or other dev-friendly tools, it can become a very useful asset for your developer toolbox. Because being able to spin up infrastructure, try something, and then destroy it, it's amazing. And that's part of what I'll show in this demo is how easy it is to like spin it up, do some work, destroy it, and then go on to your next thing.
Yeah. So as you're describing this, it looks like I can avoid the problem that I typically end up with teams that end up wanting to do this kind of more Kubernetes oriented development, or they need something like Docker Compose or whatever, is they end up with like in the case of Kubernetes, they end up with duplicate 2 copies that are slightly different of the manifest because they don't want health checks, in test or in dev or whatever. And like there's all these different things. So it looks like you've taken that into consideration here in a single file.
I think you should give me a demo, Brett. This is amazing. Every single thing that's what I'm showing here. Yes. And that's why I like this app and why we show using it Helm, because Helm is typically exactly what you say. People write their Helm charts for production. It's very useful. It's easy to deploy and manage, configuration as code. But then they typically end up with something else for development. It could be another chart, a subchart, or typically Docker Compose, because it's just so much easier and you can remove all these dev things. So part of our goal with Octeto is to say, hey, you know what? Don't create 2 manifests, because every time you have 2, you end up effectively with 2 versions of your application. And what's fun is that you have developers coding and testing on one version of your application, which is the Docker Compose, or as you were saying, the one without health checks, all those things. And then you have the production version that no one's testing until you hit like staging or production or one of those like shared environments that you have to reserve, days in advance. And we want to get that make sure that goes away. And part of what Octeto does is give you those facilities. The final section of the manifest, which is dev, is exactly what you're saying. Here is where you're going to tell Octeto what things you want to override from your production deployment when you're developing. Typical example that we do is this. For React, I don't want the production image that only has Nginx. I want an image where I can run the React hot reloader. So you just tell Octeto, replace the image of the front-end service with this image. And I'll show you in a demo in a bit, but we do things like file synchronization, open extra ports, and this is where you define that. And you can define everything from extra volumes, environment variables, config maps, extra files you want to inject into your dev environment, everything you need as development, because the reality is that production and development, they do have some differences. Like you need to run your tests. You need to be able to recompile code on dev. And with Octeto, you can do that on the fly through this definition that I'm going to show in a second. And that is part of what makes this very different from the old way of doing things, which is write code locally, commit, push to a branch, wait for your CI to produce an artifact, and then deploy that application. We want to get away from that and to a world where I just have code, make a change, and see it in my application. So that is what I'll show you in a second. So this is the manifest. You define all your services there. We have build, deploy, and dev defined. And then once you have that, all that's left to do is you go to your terminal and you run Octeto deploy. Octeto is a Go binary. It works on Mac, Linux, Windows, ARM, AMD64, any of those things. You can get it from Brew, from GitHub. It is open source. If you want to help add more things, please do contribute. We're always looking for more people. And the core command is Octeto deploy. In this case, I'm using the self-hosted version of Octeto, but you can use cloud or, as I was saying earlier, even your own Kubernetes cluster. So in this case, what deploy is doing first is building any images that were missing. So it's going to check on demand, compare the image that was built with your local repository and see if there's any files missing. It will then deploy your application. In this case, as we saw earlier, is using Helm. So you can see all the Helm logs here. And then at the end, once it's finished, so it's going to tell you where your application is running, and it's going to show you all the endpoints of the application. And this is the first phase. With this, I have my dev environment up and running. I can just go here, copy my endpoint, go to my browser, and I have this dev environment up and running. This is the entire application, all 5 services with the store. The first thing you can do here is this is running on Kubernetes. This is running on my own. You can see here, this is running on my own Octeto self-hosted instance on a Kubernetes cluster that is running on GCP. And I can interact with this application. I can, rent another movie. And what I really like about this is that now I'm testing my entire application and everything is running remotely. I don't have to worry about which version of React, of Node, of Java, how to get the store, where do I get my data from. Everything is codified on my manifests, Octeto deploy, and we're up and running. And now I have an environment that I can develop with. So now I'm going to show you is, all right, how do I interact with this? How do I start using my favorite tools to build my cloud native application? And we're going to go back to VS Code. In this case, I have a mono repo here, so everything is in the same repository. You can see all the services. So I'm going to do something small and trivial just to show you how Octeto works. So the command is Octeto up. Octeto up is what you use when you want to develop. And Octeto up takes an optional parameter, which is the name of the service you want to develop. If you don't tell Octeto, Octeto will read the file and will tell you, hey, pick one of these to develop. So for this demo, we're going to go with the catalog. It's an Express service running on Node.js. So what's going to happen now is Octeto is going to apply all those overrides that we have defined on this manifest. Internally, it's going to clone your deployment. For those of you who are more knowledgeable on Kubernetes, it's going to clone your deployment. It's going to scale to 0 the old one. It's going to apply all the overrides to the new one. And then we're going to set up a tunnel, an SSH tunnel between your local machine and this remote environment. And we're going to synchronize all your files, keep them always in sync, both ways. And we're going to give you a terminal into this remote environment. So if I look here, this looks like my terminal, but now I'm in Kubernetes. If I do something like dump the environment, you can see that this is running inside my Kubernetes environment. So I'm inside the container. If you remember, that's why we overrode this image. So we could have the dev image of the front-end service. This image of the catalog service, this image has Node already installed there with the right version. It has all my source code. And what I really like about this is because it's a clone of your production deployment, it has the same configuration. So it's already ready to talk to your database, to run your code, any of those. It has all the artifacts. So the easier thing to do, you're on start. In this case, you'll notice that our start command is using nodemon. This is because Octeto will synchronize your files. So at this point, I have my remote dev environment running on Kubernetes. I have this terminal into my service, and I can now write code. So I'm going to do something really simple here. And this is the API that returns the available catalog. And instead of returning the catalog, I'm just going to return an empty result, just to show you. I'm going to save this file. And as soon as you save a file, Octeto will do the synchronization. We use this open source project called Syncting to manage all the file synchronization. And if you notice here, when we synchronize the file, nodemon picks it up, restarts the process. And if I go to my dev environment and I refresh this, you see that now it's empty because now the catalog is empty. And this is a simple example of how Octeto enables this world of I change my code and I see the results, kind of like the way Docker Compose does it for local applications. I don't have to rebuild artifacts. I don't have to recreate infrastructure. I don't have to go to Minikube and delete my pod and wait for the new one to pick up and hope that it picks up the new image and not the old one. None of that. You change your code and you see the results. And as Brad, as you were saying, you'll notice that I didn't run any Kubernetes command. I run Octeto deploy, Octeto up. And that is part of our goal with remote dev environments, is also to abstract all these infrastructure decisions so that for most developers, if I'm a developer working on the catalog API, I can just focus on that code and not have to worry about where do I get a namespace, where do I get credentials to Kubernetes, how do I build a container image. That is something that all of us in the DevOps world are super familiar with. But front-end developers, they don't know, they don't care. They care about building great experiences and beautiful, TypeScript code. They don't care about containers, Kubernetes, kubectl, any of those things. So these remote dev environments give you some of that abstraction.
Yeah. And this is all happening in VS Code. There's not an extension or anything, right? This is all command line driven?
This is all command line. So yeah, the only thing you need to have installed, we do have an extension that makes all of this easier, but I would always like to show the pieces when I'm demoing things. Everything is done through the Octeto CLI. You download this. It has a lot more commands than I'm showing right now. But it's all based on this. And the Octeto CLI is the one that is doing the file synchronization, setting up the point-to-point connection between your local machine and your cluster, giving you the remote terminal, and a few other things it does. Everything is there. So this could be VS Code. This could be Vim, IntelliJ. It does not matter. You just run. We are building integrations with all these IDEs to make it even easier. Like in this case, there is a Octeto up command on VS Code if you have the extension installed. But you can just do it on the terminal and use whatever you want. We have some customers or users that actually they just have the here and they just run Vim here. And because Octeto synchronizes things back and forth, it just works. So it's really up to you. I don't know if Vim is installed on this container image. Let's see if it's installed. Probably it's installed. Oh, none of them. Wow. Very minimalistic. So if Vim was installed there, I could just edit there if I wanted.
Right.
And that is part for me of what's important in this kind of world of like bring your own tools and bring whatever you're more comfortable with.
Right. Okay, so we didn't talk about this before the show, but how does it? You have a Docker extension, right?
Uh-huh.
And we've been talking a lot about Docker extensions all summer. I mean, Docker announced them in the spring and at DockerCon, and there's all these use cases I never predicted for the Docker extension. So while at the same time, Octeto this feels, you're going to explain it all to me and it's going to make sense. But for me, it's like Octeto frees me from needing to have Docker or Kubernetes locally. So why would there be a Docker extension for Octeto if it seems like I could do it? It's like a leading question. What's the answer there?
No, it's a good question. And it's something that, when we saw the announcement of extensions, we were like, oh, that's really cool. And we kind of had the same question at the beginning, but as we talk to our community, and it kind of goes back to this, like flexibility. Apps are unique, right? Every app is different. And the reality is that while Octeto in its purest form allows you, as you said, to not have Docker or Kubernetes locally, not every app can run fully remote. Some of our users do want to be able to run certain things locally, whether because they need them to be closer because of resources, because of certain configurations that they have in your local machine, or simply because they prefer it that way. And for them is that we created the Docker extension to offer what we're calling hybrid dev environments, which is the idea that, imagine that this application, right? Going back to this diagram, you have 5 microservices. With the Docker Compose extension, you could have frontend, rent, and API running on Kubernetes remotely, and catalog and worker running on your local machine, talking to databases on the cloud. And for you, it's completely transparent. You just run the same thing, Octeto up from the Docker extension for Docker Compose, and it just works. And this allows you to build the developer experience that you prefer. because some of our users do want to be able to run. We have one team that is running very heavy Java-based workloads, and for them it was a much better experience to just build the jar locally and have everything else run remotely. Because for them, and it's a trade-off, right? For them, it was like they don't care too much about the super realistic dev environment. They care a lot about being able to use IntelliJ and all of their local tooling for building Java files. Modern Java compilers are very fast. They have incremental things. They work really well on your local machine. So we want to be able to offer this flexibility of really designing the dev experience that makes the most sense for your team. Because it would be very naive to assume, if we were to assume that no, everything needs to work on this model of Octeto, everything remote, right? Because there's so many different applications where you have different components, different needs, different requirements. And for that is that when we saw the extensions, we saw like a really cool way, one, to make more people aware of the world of remote dev environments. Because as you know, Docker's been investing a lot on local the container-based dev environments. We've been investing on remote container-based environments. So you can just marry them both, get the best of both worlds, keep using Docker Desktop as the core driver of your experience, which is a tool that many people are very well versed with, and start using Octeto for some of this, whether it's heavier workloads or workloads that perform better on the cloud, or things that maybe just don't want to see, and have them run locally. It's very interesting once you give all these tools to developers, how they build their own things and their own experiences, and they build what makes sense for them. And that is also one of my favorite parts of building developer tools, is that once developers kind of get what your tool is for, they come up with the craziest, most amazing experiences, because that's what works for them. And it's impossible for us to preempt every single use case. So I'd rather give you the building blocks and then have you build your experience that makes sense for you and for your team, which is what matters. Like, tools are for people to build their own things, right? Nobody uses a tool because of the tool. It's because you're building something with it. So we have to give you the blocks so you can build amazing APIs or applications. Hopefully slightly faster with Octeto, but at the end of the day, it's about the application you're building. It's not about us. So the full experience makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I'm realizing this actually scratches an itch that I have, because we were talking before the show about M1s, Apple M1 laptops, and how like I never want to go back to an Intel processor again. I mean, obviously they can change the processor and make it less loud, but my old jet engine sounding laptops are now gone, and I'm so excited. But a lot of the teams that I work with they're not thinking multi-architecture development yet. And they're not yet in their replacement life cycle on their Macs to have non-Intel. So I know it's coming for them, and they're all going to have to deal with it. But when I work with them, I basically have to spin up remote servers manually, because their containers probably won't build on mine. I have a great example of a team that actually is using Python, but they're on the back end, they're using Microsoft SQL and Python on the front end. And so they actually have a container. They don't yet have a container-based Microsoft SQL solution yet, but you would think Python would run anywhere. The problem is they have a library they're using for Microsoft SQL database connections, and that library is only x86 compatible. So when I help, I can't I can't run their container on my local machine. It just won't work, even though it's Python, because of that dependency. And I could try to build from source, but I think it failed once, and I gave up on it because I didn't want to go down that road of custom building libraries. And this is exactly that kind of this hybrid. I've actually never said these words, hybrid development environment. Technically, I think we've all done it, because we've all had manually set up remote things. Like, people sometimes they don't yet have a design for local dev databases, so they still use remote servers that are built by a database team. So I guess that's like old school hybrid. I never really considered it that, but
it's a start.
Yeah, this is cool. This gives, I like the flexibility of this, especially when I'm dealing with these multi-architecture teams.
Yeah, that's more common than you would think, because we talked to a lot of people who were like, especially as you go to like large teams, even if it's not multi architecture, just as soon as you find a team where like somebody has a Linux machine and somebody else prefers Windows, and you have some other people on Mac, just creating an experience that works for all of these OSs, it's hard, because it's like, how do I install Python on a Mac? Well, you brew. Okay, but on Windows, you have to do these 5 other things. And then suddenly you have to train your team 3 times, and you have to keep all your scripts, and then you install it, like an install.sh script doesn't work on Windows. So all these things start to become more complex even before you get to multi-architectures, or to like, specialty hardware, which is also something that remote dev environments enable. So being able to offer this experience where everything comes, all these requirements come pre-canned. It's like, oh yeah, like this. Now going back to this. This is running on Debian, on a certain version of Debian. Even though I have a macOS, my machine is as yours, an M1 Mac Mini that I love. But if I build containers and Go binaries on my Mac Mini, unless I run special commands, they will not work on my Cube cluster. But here, this is x86.
Mm-hmm.
My actual terminal, if I go to like this one, and I don't know if this command works here on a Mac, it should work, right? Yeah, my Mac is an ARM64, and all that is now more and more common. And a really cool use case for remote dev environments that some of our customers are discovering is when you need dedicated infrastructure. That there's this team in Europe in a research lab that they're building all these models on, and they need GPUs. And then they discovered that with Octeto, they could provision a cluster, a Kubernetes cluster with GPUs on the nodes, and then use Octeto to develop on the cluster and run their models there. And that way, they don't have to worry about, kind of going back to the dream of the iPad, right? With this approach, you don't need a GPU on your dev box, as long as you have access to a remote dev environment with GPUs. And it's way more efficient because you can scale those things up and down. You don't have to buy all this special hardware. You don't have to buy laptops with like very expensive GPUs per developer that are going to be sitting idle for most of the day. So it enables all these really cool scenarios where you centralize infrastructure requirements, you put everything in code, like at the end. This is also configuration as code, this file. And it just gives developers a much easier dev experience where you're no longer limited by what you have in your local machine. That becomes less and less important. I think it matters. Like, I like the IDE to be in my local machine because I like it to be fast. I like it to have a big font. I like, the nerd mono fonts and my terminal. But everything else, it doesn't matter. And that for me is something that I think we as an industry, as an ecosystem, are starting to discover how powerful Kubernetes can be for these other reasons.
Right.
For giving you a standard dev environment with the specific infra you require. And now that as you said, now that we live in this world of like multiple architectures, it's a lot easier than having to remember that when you're building a Docker file locally, you have to use buildkit and pass the different parameters. That's a much higher threshold for your a standard developer that shouldn't care about those things.
Right. All right, we've got some questions from the community. Let's see, where was the first one? Oh, by the way, we got some all stars in the house. We got Ash from Docker that said hi a while ago, and we got Victor from the DevOps Toolkit channel. If y'all haven't seen the DevOps Toolkit channel, go check that out. But let's get to some questions.
I met Victor in person for the first time at KubeCon in EU. Hey, Victor.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah, I met him at DockerCon years ago, and yeah, we need to get back to those conferences because I miss all my friends. All right, Maz has a question about how do you compare to Octeto with Tekton and Argo workflow, which I'll let you take it, but to me, those are more CI/CD tools. But it does feel like you're kind of getting into that space when you're talking about auto building images and production versus dev.
That's a question we get sometimes, and there's two answers. One, it's different. Octeto, like our idea for Octeto, is very focused on giving you the tools to spin up and interact with your remote dev environment. Production CI/CD is not something that Octeto is going to be involved with. That being said, one of the core use cases of Octeto is it allows you to use the same tooling you're using in production to deploy your dev environment, which means that you could use Argo and Octeto together to deploy your dev environment. We actually have one of our big community member works for Weaveworks, is a Flux contributor, and he uses Flux and Octeto together. We have teams that use Argo and Octeto together, and pretty much what happens, let me go back to share my screen, is that instead of having this deploy command where you're using Helm deploys, you could just hook this up to Argo and have Argo deploy your dev environment. Whether you run the Argo command here or it's already deployed. Like something I didn't mention is that every phase of this file is optional. Like if you don't want to use Octeto to deploy your dev environment because you're using maybe Argo, you don't need the deploy phase, but the dev phase will work. And we have docs on our website on how to integrate Octeto with Argo or with Tecton. And I think you can build a really cool dev experience together because Argo and Tecton are really good at workflows and defining more complex deployments and orchestrations. Like this at the end is a simple application, 5 services, very little dependencies, but you could build something in Argo and then just do Octeto up to the service that Argo deployed, and that works. You need to add a couple of annotations. It's in our docs, but it works. But to summarize, when you think of Octeto as the tool you're going to use to deploy and interact with your remote dev environment. And as you try Octeto, do try to reuse as much as you can from production. Do not my goal is to prevent people from having to have, as we were saying earlier, 2 different manifests and 2 different ways of deployment. So try. We have a community site. If you go to community.octeto.com, if you have any questions on how to do this, if you get stuck, please drop us a note there. And the entire community and the team behind Octeto, this is what we want to do. So we want to enable it. And the more use cases people share, the better. So try it out, but it does work with Argo. We have other members of the community that work. If you don't find a good sample, also we have a request for docs section on our community site. Just drop it there, put it as a feature request, and the team will gladly write some samples or maybe do another video on how to use Octeto and Argo. But I love Argo. It's a really cool product. A lot of cool things like Litmus Chaos are now being built on top of Argo. It's a very powerful tool, and I recommend that you combine it with Octeto so you can bring Argo to your dev flow and not be something that just happens at the end of the pipeline.
Yeah. All right. So it sounds like Victor and I are planning for us to have all drinks in Detroit at KubeCon. By the way,
I like that. Yes.
Those of you that are able to travel to Detroit for KubeCon in the autumn, I will be there, and it sounds like a lot of us are going to be there. So feel free to reach out. Please reach out, because I love meeting people that I love meeting people that we have that show up on YouTube or in our Discord, which now has 10,000 people in it. I'm very excited about that number, so I name
That's
drop
an amazing number.
I never drop that all the time. Yeah, sadly there's not 10,000 people in there chatting every day, but it's active every day. I can't keep up with all the conversations in DevOps, and we don't have a development environment channel in there, but we totally should, because this is the kind of thing that I think if we had 100 shows this year and we had 100 different developers on, their local workflows and setups would be different. It'd almost be like there's probably a show out there. It's called Show Me Your Dev Setup. It's kind of like the car shows or the home decor shows. All right, so we have a couple more questions. I want to get through them really quick. Let's see. Vicky's asking about CRDs. I'm assuming you're asking, Vicky, about CRDs in general, this is not that show. If you want to have more general discussions around Kubernetes topics, I do a monthly show here, still on Thursdays, but you can find out when that monthly show is going to be in our Discord. So our Discord over there, devops.fan, over in that corner above Ramiro, that is the that is the community we've built there, and there are now events in there, so you can see all the upcoming YouTube live shows, when we're going to do Discord hangouts, and stuff like the Udemy Q&A. So the Udemy Q&A is what you want to come back for if you want to sort of just get some basic knowledge on Kubernetes stuff. But that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. So we've got another one on. See, is there any resources for us to learn the architecture like these that you're using in the demo, essentially, from Mirak? And that's actually a good question. I look up on GitHub. I just Google GitHub, or use Google to search GitHub for like microservice architectures, or whatever the architecture you're looking for, like if you're trying to go serverless or whatever. And there's always good ones out there. On this show, I get that question a lot. So we have, if you look up, there's a Google example, there's the sock shop, there's at least 3 or 4 that I can probably think of that if you could probably find on a quick Google. And they're all projects on GitHub, at least the last that I remembered. I don't know if you have any, Ramiro, that you would consider other than your own. Your demo is up. Scroll up in the chat. There's the demo that you just did.
We have a couple of demos, but those demos are more focused on how to integrate Octeto in a flow of microservice. We do take some shortcuts on to keep them simple on the microservice architecture side of things. Google has one, the Google Store. It's on GitHub. They have this microservices demo with like 20 microservices. That's really good to like, because they do microservices, they have telemetry, they have Istio, service mesh, they have retries. It's a lot, but I think it's a really good one to kind of, you want to see what a production-like application looks like. This movies app actually is fairly realistic when it comes to the architecture and how we use Helm and stuff like that. That is something that also take a look. But yeah, those are 2 of my favorite. I think microservices is also something that requires a lot of practice, and it depends a lot on your own requirements. But yeah, that store, I think that's the one. Yeah, that one. No, there's one called Hipster Store.
Ooh, yeah, there might be one there. I'm gonna throw this.
Look it up.
I'm gonna put some links up in chat. The Google one is the online boutique.
That one. If you go to Google Cloud Platform /microservices demo, that is my favorite. That one, yeah, that is my favorite because it really has a little like the modern architecture, except for Octeto. But it uses a scaffold, which also kind of gives you similar experience. It uses gRPC. It has OpenCensus, which is the new for telemetry. It uses logging. It's really good, especially if you're building something on GCP or in GKE. That is like the perfect reference application.
Yeah,
it's big though, so you need to take some time to kind of understand.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff too is very framework specific. So if you're like the way you architect a microservice might change a lot based on the frameworks and languages that you're using. That's an interesting discussion, but let me see if we can run through a couple more of these rapidly. Let's see. Frank asked, what would you say the biggest advantages it is over tools like telepresence that proxies their local running app to a remote Kubernetes cluster?
That's a question we get a lot, and telepresence is a great tool. I like it a lot. It's fun because Octeto and telepresence, the CLI, kind of give you the same experience on opposite directions. Because telepresence, you have the service running locally, and then it kind of proxies the cluster into telepresence. Octeto is the other way around. The service is running on the remote cluster, and then we synchronize the code into, or binaries, into the cluster. The main benefit of Octeto over telepresence is that with Octeto, you have a more realistic dev environment. Because in Octeto, and in the demo I show you today, like my service is on Kubernetes talking to the other services in Kubernetes. So that means I'm using the same secret management. I'm using the same network policies, the same identity. Like I didn't show it on this demo, but you could have a dev environment where you have very specific, limited users, different service accounts. So as you get deeper into like leveraging all the policies of Kubernetes, I do believe that the approach of having your service running on the cluster instead of outside of the cluster is more realistic and is one less thing that's going to be different between dev and prod, which for me is something that's very important. The other aspect that I didn't show you, and I'm going to show you real quick if I can share my screen, is there's another component of Octeto that I didn't show you, which is the dashboard. This dashboard is the UI of Octeto. You have the CLI, but you also have a UI. This dashboard gives you a lot of different things, but main things is it gives you namespace management, a UI where you can see the logs of your application, the state, and it gives you the ability to create multiple namespaces and share them with the rest of your team. You know? All my teammates are here, so everybody that goes to this is our demo instance to demo.octeto.dev, you can see everybody here has access to the same cluster with a quota, with policies, with a UI-based approach where the same thing I show you with Octeto deploy, I can just do it here and says, hey, I am on show. Okay, create a namespace. This creates a namespace with policies on Kubernetes, and I can directly go to GitHub and launch any branch of my dev environment from here. So Octeto gives you all this UI-based approach, which going back to the ethos of we don't want everybody to be an expert on Kubernetes is something else you also get. Everything you do in the CLI, you can do it through here. You can share your namespace with your teammates. You can share the links. You can see the logs here. So you also get that you don't get with telepresence. So Octeto, I see it. I don't like to call it a platform, but it is like a full experience on how you manage, how you define, deploy, interact, and destroy your remote dev environment. Because something else that it's here is also Octeto, and our large customers like this a lot. It has this policy on how to scale your cluster and when to delete your development environments, so that when your dev environments are idle, like let's say that I do the show and then I forgot that I left this running. By Friday, Octeto will be like, okay, Ramiro hasn't used this dev environment in 24 hours. Great. I should just scale it to 0. And then after another week, we'll be like, oh, Ramiro hasn't used this in a week. Let me delete it. So you get all these extra things that they really matter a lot once you are ready to have this for your entire team. Like if it's just you, the CLI is good enough. If you have a team or you want a bigger abstraction on top of Kubernetes, that dashboard is really useful and it's free. Like our starter plan is free for up to 10 developers. So you just get the Helm chart, install it. And then if you want commercial support or a bigger team, we have commercial plans, but that is one of the biggest differences. And what I always tell our users and customers, realistic dev environments are very important. Not for everybody. It depends on your requirements, on your stack, your application. So you have to think, is this kind of where I want to go? But if you want realistic dev environments and you want to abstract Kubernetes, that's our sweet spot. That's where I believe we chose that to be our specialization. The same way that telepresence gives you, hey, local service, connect to your clusters, and they do it really well. And there are other solutions out there. Gitbug will give you the IDE, but not Kubernetes. And there's a bunch of others, and like VC will give you preview environments, but not Kubernetes. That's what I love about this new world of dev experience. There's so many different really cool projects for you to pick based on what you need.
Yeah.
And our approach is we're very friendly. We interact with everything. We integrate with everything because we want you to build the best dev experience for you and for your team.
Yeah. I certainly like the flexibility. Conrad's asking, speaking of flexibility, he says, hey, I use Mac ports instead of Homebrew. Can Octeto be installed through Mac ports package manager?
We don't have an installation for that, but it should.
Yeah.
Like if not, the easiest thing to do, if you go to our docs, we have a script that you can just run, a one-liner to install the binary. You can download the binary from GitHub and just copy it to a local place. But if you're an expert in Mac ports or any of your viewers, and you want to contribute that to our source code, that'll be fantastic because I've never used Mac ports.
I was going to say, that sounds like a great first PR. It sounds like a
Somebody
great
uses
first
a
VR.
Snap, so they wrote the Snap installer
Oh,
for
nice.
Windows,
Mm-hmm.
which was a big surprise. Actually, very popular. So yeah, if anybody's interested in building the MacPorts one, please help. It'll be
Yeah,
amazing. If you go to GitHub/Octeto/Octeto, that is the CLI. It's all open source. It's all there.
yeah. All right, next question. Um, Harineth, sorry if I mispronounced that name. Is there a way to stop or prune the image once a server in image is up and running and give acknowledgement to next image execution? I'm not sure if this is this Octeto specifically that you're asking about. Sorry, I think this question is probably 10 minutes old, so I'm not sure if they're still
Interesting.
around. But
So we do have. So one feature we're building is automatically pruning all images. Right now it's done, but it's not very smart. We're gonna do it smarter. One thing you can do though with Octeto is when I was showing is, let me share my screen again to show this, is, when you run Octeto up, this puts the service in what we call development mode, right? And you're running all the commands and you get your code synchronization. When you're done, you run Octeto down, which is the opposite of up, in this case the catalog, and this will redeploy that service with the configuration it had before. So we'll go back to your production image or your standard image, and it will remove all the dev changes. Like if you remember, we removed the catalogs, it was returning an empty space here. If I go back and refresh, now you'll see it's back to the old code. So up to develop, down to restore to the way you were. Those are ways to kind of restore the configuration if that's what you were asking. There's also a command called Octeto destroy, which will destroy your dev environment, delete everything, all the resources. There's options if you want to keep your volumes around, if you know keep your configuration around. It's going to install everything, delete all resources, and then when you run deploy again, it'll be from scratch, which for me is a key part of ephemeral environments, is having one command to make them disappear. So these ways you can prune images, restore configurations. I don't know if this is what you meant, but one thing we're going to build in the next few months is a smarter way to delete images, but because we don't want you to even think about pruning images. Like, I don't want you to think of images. I want you to think of your application,
yeah,
and it's not your application, and that's it.
yeah. Hopefully, you don't have to worry about that. That's the kind of a goal. I see that as like a goal of a tool like this. It's like I don't want to have
Right.
to think about all that because, like, yeah, I mean, that's one of the like Docker gave us so many things, but I still don't have automatic local image cleanup. Like it's now easier than ever. Docker has an extension even. You can look at space usage, but it's still not automatic. Like it seems to me that if Docker engine knows what it executes and it keeps a history of what it's executed, it would know that I haven't used an image in 2 weeks and it would just prune it. There's actually a script I run that I can do it. So I know for people out there, they're like, I have a solution for you. And I'm like, yeah, no, I do it. I just do it on my own. It's not
Yeah,
a
but it's.
checkbox.
I agree,
Yeah.
and when I prune my images when I'm running out of space,
Yeah, that's right. When I
and
get a
every time I'm like,
complaint.
oh, the image failed to build. Why? Oh, I don't have any space on Docker desktop. Oh, okay. And I just prune everything
Yeah.
and start from scratch. And
Yeah.
if there
Yeah.
was, and that's what we want to build. We want to build a way that the same way that we idle, like we delete idling remote environments.
Hmm.
Because something that I didn't show is when you set Octeto on your cluster, we have a fork of BuildKit that has a shared cache. So everybody on your team, when you're building images remotely, you have the same Docker caches. So
Mm.
you're not starting from scratch every time, which is a time saver.
Yeah.
We want to build on top
That's
of that.
normally a fancy feature you have to put in your CI, and it usually
Yeah,
doesn't work with dev environments. It only works for
exactly.
production deployments. Yeah. So that's cool.
And it's cool because for developers, if you think about this, you rarely have to rebuild the entire thing. Because if you and I are working on a feature, it's the same base image. I just change one code, one
Yeah.
file, you change another one. So having this shared cache helps a lot. So we want to build the next level, which is also like pruning all these things automatically based on utilization. So I don't want people to think of how to build, how to push. Is this what you were saying earlier? This idea of like an ephemeral container image, an
Mm.
ephemeral registry, an ephemeral build service. It's not running in your machine. It's managed automatically. So you just don't care about these things. And I think that's a key part of if you're building your own dev experience, these are important things to think about because people spend a lot of time waiting for Docker builds and optimizing your build, sharing caches.
Yeah.
It's hard, but once you do it once, it just works,
Yeah.
and it's such a time saver.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to try to make this the last question. Y'all have had some great questions today. Hassam's asking, how does Octeto have any advantages, or does Octeto have any advantages over competitors like Scaffold and DevSpace?
So it's different. Scaffold is a command line tool. It's focused on automating all the tasks that you do when you're developing. So it will automatically build your image. They have a code synchronization, so we have a lot of things in common. But Scaffold is not really a remote development environment tool. It's a development automation tool. And I think the difference is going back to what I was talking about with telepresence, is the idea of how do you spin up a realistic dev environment on demand and give your developers an easy way to interact with it. That's where we're very different. DevSpace has a lot of similarities. I think of all the products I've seen out there, I think Lucas and his team and our team, we have a lot of like shared ideas. They're like really cool people. I've known, I've met them, a lot of them, and hi to them if they're seeing this. DevSpace and Octeto is more similar. I think the experience, we focus a lot more on abstracting Kubernetes away than they do. We give you this build service I was talking about, this registry. We have a feature to do also preview environments, which means an environment that's created on a PR. Dev Spaces is more focused on dev infrastructure. They have virtual clusters, which are really cool if you need to give every developer a cluster instead of a namespace, which is what we do. So there are some difference. And in some of these tools, it's funny because, and we always get these questions where we're like talking to our commercial opportunities. If you go to a website, we all talk about the same things: developer experience, efficiency. So it might look like all of us are the same tools, but I think right now, every tool in this space is doing things from a different point of view. So it is important, as you think of your dev experience, to take a look at all these tools, spend some time, and see which one solves the pain points you want to solve. Like I was saying early, remote dev environments, how to give your team access to Kubernetes, and realistic dev environments. That's what we're really good at. If you're looking for like virtual clusters, DevSpace is your best call. If you're looking for running workloads locally, well, our Docker extension is great, or telepresence. So really, it's really exciting. Like I've been on this space for many years, and for the longest time, nobody really cared about the experience. It was only like a few obsessed people,
Yeah.
like me. So now there's such a big offer out there that it's beautiful, and I do recommend that. Look at all of them, talk to them. If you go to KubeCon, I'm more than happy to talk about it for hours until you run away. And at least on the KubeCon in Europe, Dev Spaces was there, Loft was there, we were there, Ambassador was there, Garden, also another really good tool for dev experience, was there. So if you get a chance to attend those virtually or in person, that's a great place to ask and say, hey, I have these problems. How do X or Y solves them? And tools are great, but using the wrong tool, using the tool for the wrong thing is going to make your life a lot harder. So make sure that you pick the tool that solves the problem that you need solved best. Docker is great for certain things, but if you're spinning up VMs, Docker is not a good idea.
Right. Well, great. All right, so people can get started at octeto.com, right? There are open source and free plans. Ramiro's detailed a lot of those over the last hour. So if you want to check it out, you don't have to shell over any money to use the open source tools, or I mean, it's actually kind of really cool. I did not realize you had a 10 dev plan for free. So that's interesting. I'm gonna have to check that out because whenever I'm working,
And that one, I don't think it's on a website yet. But if you shoot me an email at Ramiro@Octeto, I can, and any of your listeners, it's coming out soon, like in the next week or two. I may have released this earlier.
Well, yeah, so you can bug him on Twitter. Our Twitter handles are below us. You can bug him or Octeto on Twitter, and you can send him that email if you would like to check it out more. So we're both going to be at KubeCon, so if you're going to be there in the autumn, that's 3 months away. It's coming up quick. So we'll be there. Please let us know, and let's meet up for happy hour or just at the conference for lunch or something. And then just a reminder to everyone, this show, so for the next 3 weeks, not going to have a guest, sadly. We're going to have premiere videos. So we'll still be doing the 1 o'clock on Thursdays, and we're going to have the chat. But we're actually I'm going to premiere some videos that I've made, and then we'll get back to the guests at the end of August. That'll be fun. The next ones coming up are, we have our high fivers on August 31st. So you remember to sign up on Patreon for the high fiver monthly chat, and let's see. Future guests. We've got Armo, the company that makes the Kubescape. Is it Kubescape? Scanner. Yeah. Armo, I think. And so we're going to talk about Kubernetes security, and then we're going to have Liz Rice on, which is a repeat guest on the show. Liz Rice, all things security, containers. We're going to be talking about that in September as well. So please come back on Thursdays and get your merch below. Get your coffee mug and your T-shirt for DockerCon or for KubeCon, not DockerCon. We already had that, KubeCon. And thanks so much, Ramiro. I really appreciate having you on the show. We will see everyone next week.
Thanks for having me, Brett. I'm looking forward to seeing that sneakernet T-shirt on your shop so I can get it.
Yeah, sneakernet. All right, thanks everyone. Ciao.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.